Do you hear it? The echoes of the past, the whispers of forgotten truths, fragments of memories lost in the shadows. Welcome to BRAINROT, Echoes, where we bring you stories long buried, unravel mysteries cloaked by time, and guide you through the darkest corners of the mind and the universe. Each video is more than just content. It's an echo resonating deep within, urging you to question, to wonder, to explore. Backend index pointing right, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join us in listening to the echoes the world tried to silence. The fleeing, the hunting. It's important to understand that the Great Alliance was not a benevolent organization, nor was it particularly malevolent. It was not built to be good, though it certainly tried. Nor was it built to be evil, though many of its laws and policies have been warped to commit acts of horrific brutality. It was built primarily to endure, to stand as a bulwark against savagery and chaos. And, as such, it has been astoundingly effective in its longevity. In that longevity, the Alliance has accrued millennia of customs, rituals, and traditions which drift in the wake of its stately operation across the ages. Its officials spend their thankless lives wrangling with the mess of it. It could be argued that, however superfluous many of these traditions might seem, they nonetheless serve to lend the institution a certain inertia, keeping it stable as any treaty or armed threat. One of our oldest traditions is what concerns us today, and its strange history with one of the Alliance's newest members. When humanity finally breached the confines of its humble empire and became known to the most venerable institution of the galaxy, we told them of our strange tradition. When a new race joins the ranks of the Great Alliance, it is common charter to receive a sobriquet fitting of its characteristic qualities. Each name is a point of pride. It speaks of a race's history, not merely of its civilizations, but of its very evolution. What gave it the strength to pull itself from the muck of lowly life to reach for the stars? The names were not complicated and followed a basic schema. The brachiating giants, with their spindly towers reaching nearly as high as their ambition became the climbers. The stoic Mador, who from nomadic herds had developed into mobile cities to armored adventuring fleets, took the name the Wanderers in Might. The telepathic collective mind of the Writ, operating in perfect synchronicity, received the Unifiers. It was a silly tradition, as so many are, but like so many others, there was a strange truth hidden within it. A name, after all, is a promise, and a warrior of the glorious dead was likely to fight to the bitter end for a lesser reason than to uphold his species' reputation. More than anything, it spoke of the qualities a race was proudest of or most aspired to. There were those who said it oversimplified, or categorized, or boasted, but the tradition had held firm through 1,000 cycles of peace and conflict. So, despite its ancient provenance, the topic of what named humanity would choose dominated Alliance discussions for many cycles. More than merely a rich source of gossip, their choice would lend valuable insight into diplomacy, trade agreements, and the entertainment industry. The cautious approachers were unlikely to be swayed by gambling advertisements, were they? Humanity made its decision with nearly impolite haste. After only a few cycles, their representative stood before the Alliance Senate to be formally inducted into our ranks. Call us, they said, the fleeing. It was a title that stirred gossip for many cycles thereafter. Biologically, it made sense. Erect primates were certainly built for running, not with any particular speed, but with a shambling stride that seemed to serve their purpose. But there were 1,000 other names they could have chosen. What sort of species named itself after a cowardice? What promise did that lend? The cycles that followed only solidified this perception. Terrans proved to be an unusually conflict-averse race. Where others would fight, they negotiated. Where others would seize, they ceded ground. When forced to battle, caught between hammer and anvil, they always sought escape and found some peaceful resolution. This comportment earned them many friends, but few allies who could trust a coward to support them in a crisis. When peace could not be found, when it was time to stand, who could trust the fleeing? Perhaps it was the name itself that finally encouraged the Lashy. No species held such a contentious position in the alliance as the Lashy. Time and again, they had instigated conflict and chaos for their own gain. Time and again, they had proven their worth when the alliance needed to apply proper brute force. Their evolution as apex predators was reflected in their lightning-fast assault fleets and their brutal politics. One way or another, the Lashy had deservedly earned the sobriquet the Ravagers. Perhaps it's unfair to judge every individual of a species by their racial reputation. There were certainly Lashy who were famed for their kindness, their forgiveness, and hundreds of cycles with the Alliance may have weaned them from their most brutal behaviors. But a name is a promise, after all. Historians across the galaxy can appreciate the difficulty in pinpointing the root cause of any particular conflict. The Lashy were certainly looking to expand their territory, and the pristine wildernesses of the Terrans were tempting. But the Lashy royalty was also facing dissent within its aristocracy and needed a common foe to unite the ranks. And of course, their economic power had been declining due to some recent trade sanctions, and they crave an opportunity to remind the Alliance of their military might. But it can also be argued that the Lashy simply had done it to many younger species before and were perfectly happy to do it again. Those of us who sympathized with humanity realized too late the careful web the Lashy had spun for them. More than 100 minor disputes. Surely the Terrans did not know that they had been in the Alliance a few cycles. The Lashy had been navigating its legal morass for centuries. They had drawn the noose around humanity with exquisite grace. If the Lashy had simply declared war on the Terrans, we might have deflected the blow. There were a number of Alliance laws and procedures that applied to cases such as these, ones which the Lashy's victims had relied upon in prior conflicts. Rules of quarter, rules of engagement, foreign aid, and the like. But this time was different. The ritual was known as the Corral. It pitted one Alliance member against another, with no aid or interference from other members. In theory, it allowed disputes to be settled without igniting a powder keg of alliances and counter-alliances. In practice, it was most often used to cut a vulnerable species from the herd. It was a barbaric tradition from the Alliance's brutal early days. But as stated before, age lends inertia to tradition, and it had proved disappointingly difficult to remove. To declare a corral, very specific conditions needed to be met, conditions the Lashy had carefully engineered. Each conflict had formed a piece of an intricate tapestry, depicting the Terrans as unjust aggressors and the Lashy as victims. At least on paper, and in an institution as hidebound as the Alliance, paper was the most effective evidence. When every piece had been put into place, all that remained was to declare formal war, which they proceeded to do with enthusiasm and confidence on the floor of the Alliance Congress. Before thousands of delegates, the Terran senator pleaded with the Lashy to reconsider. "They're a young power," he said. "This war, and all that comes next, will shape the future of both species." The Lashy senator laughed in his face. A laugh from the Ravagers put everyone else in the room on edge. Few predators rose to sentience, and the sight of their cruelly sharp teeth stirred a primal fear long buried under veneers of civilization. He drew a finely wrought scroll, the formal declaration of war, and threw it at the Terran's feet. He spoke the ancient challenge. "Corral," he said, "embrace us. Our gift is now blades and cuts into your hand. Call not on your allies. Their doors are closed to you. Beg not for terms. They shall be denied. Flee to your lairs, gather your strength, and stand. We are coming." The Terrans had a humble fleet, capable of chasing pirates from their trade routes. And, of course, as soon as war was declared, they began the process of battleship production. Factories in use since before humanity unified were put back into operation. But it would be many cycles before they could form battle lines across their worlds. And the Lashy had been planning this war for a long time. In fact, their accumulation of military assets was the subject of one of their many political conflicts with humanity. Until they could fully mobilize, the Lashy had their pick of Terran territories. The only question was which planet they would attack first. The Koro stars were a tempting option. They were closest to Lashy territory and would make an excellent addition to their territory. but they were wildernesses undeveloped. They could be taken in due time once they had broken the Terran's lines. Earth itself was tempting. The loss of a species' homeworld would be a crippling blow, one that had sent many empires into a slow spiral to extinction. But humanity was well aware of its vulnerability and had prepared more thoroughly. More than a quarter of their forces were arrayed to protect their home system. The Lashy might eventually take it, but the cost would be immense. They needed a symbol, something that would shatter humanity's will with one swift, single blow, something they hadn't properly defended, something they took for granted so utterly that they could not conceive of its loss. It might have taken years to find, but as stated, they had been planning this war for a long time. Humanity's homeworld was still slowly recovering from the depredations of their desperate journey to the stars. It would be hundreds of cycles before the poison could be removed from its seas and skies. They were wiser now. Their new worlds were developed with careful attention to their ecologies. But even among its harmonious peers, Avalon stood out. Avalon was their chance to do better. The inhabitants of its cities were stewards of the planet, not its rulers. Trees stood tall, animals roamed free, and fields of tall grass stretched from horizon to horizon. The planet was a symbol of everything the Terrans aspired to, or at least it had been. The Ravagers descended upon Avalon like wolves on a sheepfold. For the first time, its inhabitants looked up to see fire in the night sky as laser lances pierced through the meager defensive lines. The Terrans fought with courage, ferocity, and desperation. It did not matter. Within hours, the Lashy had taken the planet. They could have abducted the natives, carried them off into slavery. They could have planted their flags on the city walls, garrisoned the fortresses, plundered their treasures. The Ravagers could have routed the fleeing and ruled comfortably over their new territories. But a name is a promise, after all. They took no prisoners on Avalon. They claimed no prizes. They landed no colonists. They plundered no resources. They leveled the cities with plasma bombardment and burned the very atmosphere. Field and forest burned to ash, the seas boiled, and the animals within them died bewildered at their fate. Humanity's shining jewel was left a black, lifeless rock. The Lashy had made an example of the planet. It had taught the Terrans a lesson. No action was forbidden under the corral. Humanity's only hope of survival lay in unconditional surrender. The counterattack was inevitable. The Lashy had cut deep into humanity. There would be a single furious retaliation bursting forth from their wounds. But it would be the rage of a wounded beast. The next attack would be weaker, and the one after that weaker still. The Ravagers had evolved from deadly predators, harassing the flanks of larger prey until they collapsed. This sort of warfare was second nature. So, humanity's attack on the Lashy stronghold of Vakalat came as little surprise. Nor did the ferocity of it. The scale of the attack, however, was worthy of comment. The Terran military was a meager thing, stretched thin to cover their trade fleets. But now, it was the Lashy's turn to look up at the night sky as it filled with thousands of new stars. These were not the guardians of the trade fleets, but the fleets themselves, cargo haulers, mining vessels, tugboats now crudely equipped with rotating cannons, single-shot railguns, and cheap rockets. The Lashy, proud warrior cultists of military elites, learned a human term that day, technicals. They also learned the effectiveness of non-weapons. Rivet guns, plasma cutters, and mining drills seemed hardly practical for purposes of war, but when a Lashy battlecruiser was set upon by half a dozen vessels with empty magazines and broken railgun coils, throwing themselves at the larger prey to harass its flanks, that argument buckled at the same time as the fuel tanks. Vakalat was a heavily fortified planet. Its forces were formidable. Its captains were seasoned veterans. And within a single sub-cycle, it fell to those it had disdained as warriors, to forces it had never even considered a threat, to the fleeing. This in itself was not particularly alarming. Lashy military doctrine was offensive to an extreme. They put little stock in defense. They had lost ground, but they would soon retake it, and more. The Terran spirit had been broken. They would take the next planet with ease. Except they didn't. They sent their fleet to me, the mercantile planet, to swallow the world in 1,000 mouths. But at me, they were swamped, choked, suffocated by 10,000 more vessels. And now the Terrans had taken Roko, the Lashy breadbasket. They had attempted a daring lightning strike at port, the Terran jump gate, to cripple their forces. But at port they were repulsed. And then humanity took the shipyards of Barakina, and the Lashy found themselves crippled. They had burned technicals in droves, but now humanity was producing actual battleships faster than anyone could imagine, and they were monstrosities. The Lashy were masters of war. They had scoffed at crudely armed mercantile vessels, but now they could appreciate these new vessels with the eye of a connoisseur. They traced the cruel, graceful lines of the bow. They admired the engines, envied the shields against their firepower, feared the searing lasers that tore apart their own ships. At every battlefield, the Lashy looked at those ships and measured their own destruction. On the floor of the Alliance Congress, the Lashy senator called for a new proposal. His demeanor was still proud, his sneering smile still unwavering, but there was a hesitation in him, an uncertainty that had not been there before. He invited the Terran senator to the floor. "This war has taken its toll on both sides," he said, "and the Lashy have made their point. The Corral ritual will be rescinded. The Ravagers will withdraw their fleet. The Terrans will return to their system, and 1,000 Alliance subcommittees will descend to provide aid to the war-torn nations." It was a good deal. The fleeing had proven themselves unexpectedly brutal in combat and had significantly expanded their territory from the conflict. Few young species could hold their own against the Ravagers, and none of them had actually gained territory in the process. Several nations had offered the small species an alliance, eager to recruit those deadly vessels for their own purposes. But they were still small, a mere fraction of their invaders, and no amount of tactical genius or righteous indignation could bridge that gap. The fleeing had pricked the beast and sent it reeling, but they could not hope to sustain their success against the Lashy fighting to defend their homes. The deal they offered was the only real option. Before thousands of delegates, the Terran senator walked to the Lashy. He drew a small piece of cloth from his uniform. As he slowly unfolded the charred scrap, we realized what it was. Pulled from a field of black rock and glass that stretched from horizon to horizon, all that remained of Avalon's flag. He threw it at the Lashy senator's feet. "Corral," he said. "Blades cut both ways. You began the ritual, you will see it end. Call not on your allies. Their doors are closed to you now. Beg not for terms. They shall be denied. Flee to your lairs, gather your strength, and stand. We are coming." The war continued. The Lashy tried every trick of warfare they had learned in 1,000 lifetimes. They laid intricate traps, picked apart Terran fleets, mounted glorious last stands. Humanity's vessels, terrifying warships as they were, could still be outwitted, outmaneuvered, dragged down by numbers. Their burning wrecks became a familiar sight in Lashy territories. But it was never enough. The Terrans laid their own traps, fought as well as the Ravagers. Every Terran vessel the Lashy burned brought dozens more, and beyond that was their overwhelming relentlessness. However many were slain, more came in an endless wave. In ravaging the fleeing, the Ravagers had stumbled upon something entirely unexpected, an equal, perhaps a superior. And that was the real tragedy for the Lashy. If they had cultivated humanity, joined forces, they might have stood against the Alliance itself. But in their pride, they had wounded a beast and now felt the full strength of its claw. Slowly, quietly, we and other nations withdrew our offers of alliance to the Terrans. We had pitted them as victims, supported them as underdogs. Now we feared them as monsters. We belatedly recalled what the Terran ambassador had said. This war, and all that comes next, will shape the future of both species. We remembered how desperately he had pleaded for peace. Only now did we realize exactly what he had tried to prevent. The war continued. The Terrans had opened a breach in the Ravagers could not stop poured into the wound any more than they could stop the moons in their orbits. Humanity did not devastate the planets they took. They merely burned the shipyards and launch zones, crippled their ability to mobilize, and kept moving. As they carve a line of fire across the planets, their objective became clear. Nothing less than the Lashy homeworld, Katet. The story of its fall risks becoming repetitive, an echo of every battle before, differing only in its monstrous scale. The Lashy fought with courage, ferocity, and desperation. It was not enough. On they came, until Katet's low orbit was choked with burning metal and flesh. As dawn rose on the ancient Lashy homeworld, the sun shone randomly, filtered through the thick haze of war debris. And it dawned on a Terran flag. The war continued. Katet was theirs. They had cut deep into the Lashy. Surely there would be a furious retaliation, but it was the rage of a wounded beast. The next attack was weaker, and the one after that weaker still. They were bleeding out in a slow spiral to extinction. But the Terrans were not content to wait. They had taken the homeworld, yes, but they did not hold the planet responsible for the genocide of Avalon, nor blame the entire Lashy species for war crimes. No, they knew who was to blame. The Lashy royalty, whose word had been lost since time immemorial. It was at their command that Avalon had burned. Bringing them to justice, however, proved difficult. Before the first Terran vessel had appeared in Katet's sky, the royalty had quietly slipped away to a nearby system. Their absence was not missed by the planet's defenders. In fact, it was no small factor in their defeat. Nonetheless, humanity had been denied their true objective. So they took that system too. Again, the nobility fled, and again, the Terrans followed. When that system in turn was taken, the royalty split to have a better chance. Some disguised themselves and hid among the Lashy population. Some paid exorbitant bribes to other nations to take them in violation of ancient ritual. Some sought refuge with pirates on the rim, who spoke no cant of the corral. Still, humanity did not relent. Where brute force was not enough, they turned to cunning. Their agents infiltrated their hiding places and tracked down every offending member with a nearly preternatural ability. Those who hid among their populations were arrested. The nations who sheltered them were confronted, threatened with exposure unless they surrendered. Brute force still came in handy on the rim of known space. The Terrans ravaged outlaw fleets with a ruthlessness the Ravagers could respect. They had begun their war against pirates. Now, in its dying days, they found themselves fighting them again. But now they carried a purpose and a rage the outlaws had never seen. Every one of their secret bolt holes was hunted down and burned. Before long, they were handing over the nobility to prevent further bloodshed. And even then, the war continued. The last free member of the Lashy royalty, the son of the reigning king, had fled to the last stronghold he had, the planet Ublo, whose unique ionosphere corrupted any technology more advanced than a sharpened stick. His ship burned a dead hulk, his instruments destroyed. He landed on Ublo's surface with only a parachute and his flesh. A one-way trip in every sense of the word. But that was fine. He was of the Ravagers, evolved to take the top spot in the food chain. Ublo was a world dominated by wind-swept dry plains, but prey could still be found if one knew where to look. He could survive here, an exiled prince, and retain a shred of his pride. The Terrans wouldn't dare pursue him to Ublo. Anyone who came after him would not return. They would have to be content to leave him in exile. He held to that certainty. It warmed him on cold nights, lent comfort in isolation. It kept him going for nearly a full cycle, until he saw the Terran ship landing and felt it wither in his chest. The vessel crashed as they always did. But like the prince, its pilot landed safely. A lone human woman, carrying nothing but her flight suit and a single knife. She looked at the wreckage of her ship, her only hope of a journey home. Then she turned towards the endless plains, and she began to run. There are stories told of the long pursuit between the Ravagers and the fleeing. If we lived in a more romantic age, they would be myths. Instead, it is merely filed in the historical and dramatic archives. It played out over many cycles. A planet is an immeasurable distance to walk, and though the Terran had landed as close as possible to the Lashy vessel, that merely reduced it to a small fraction of immeasurable. She had no equipment to track the prince, no conveyance, no medicine. But then, neither did he. The Lashy were ambush predators, built for fast bursts of speed. They burst to attack prey, all claw and fang, for that short, decisive chase of life or death. A slow Lashy could outrun an average human on their worst day. But humans were not built for bursts of speed. They were built for endurance, a fact the prince slowly realized in his unending flight. The Terran ran slowly, but she simply did not stop. The Lashy ran as far as his aching legs would take him, but every time he stopped for a rest, the distance between them shortened. He simply could not outrun her, nor could he evade her. He employed the ancient tricks of the wilderness, crossing streams, avoiding soft ground, doubling back. He set traps for the human with all the cunning he could think of, but none of them worked. She could track him by bent twigs, a scent on the wind. She saw through his traps as though she had laid them herself. The Terrans had chosen their hunter carefully. The Lashy prince, apex predator as he was, soon learned a human term, persistence hunting. Perhaps if he had faced her head-on, he might have defeated her. In the end, he was still a killer by instinct, and she carried no weapon but a knife. But his courage was gone. His pride was broken. His homeworld taken. His nation conquered. He could no more hope to defeat her than his species could defeat hers. In the end, all he could do was run, and she was far better at that. The Terran occupied every waking moment of his thoughts. He could not even escape her in his dreams. Closer and closer she came, until he ran to exhaustion, until he crawled desperately across the desert, until he finally collapsed. When she finally arrived and put the knife to his throat, he was nearly grateful. 10 years after the Terran vessel crashed on Ublo's shores, a breach opened in the planet's protective ionosphere. Not for long. Only enough time for a small starship to land on the surface and return. But even as it touched down, two figures could be seen, a human woman and her Lashy captive, arriving at the prearranged landing site. The technology to defy Ublo's peculiar prison atmosphere was not beyond imagining. It could be accomplished by a team of great scientists with the right motivation, but it was an extraordinary expense of time and resources to capture a single individual. It seemed to be the capstone to humanity's most revealing conflict, the extent to which they would go to avenge their wrongs. And finally, the war was over. We watched with awe and fascination as humanity decided the fate of the Lashy. The species was entirely at their mercy. They could claim their entire territory as war prizes or reduce them to vassals. Enslavement of the entire population would not have been out of reach then, nor would utter extermination. No action was forbidden under the Corral, and the Terrans had proven themselves an inhuman species. But humanity did none of these things. They imprisoned the royalty on charges of war crimes. They were brought to the ruins of Avalon. The Terrans had begun the arduous process of recreating life on the blighted planet. The first basic exposures had begun to grow among the glass and ash. It would be over 1,000 cycles before the planet regained its former beauty, but the Lashy royalty would work its land for the rest of their lives to speed the process. The remaining nobility, those whose connections were too tenuous to be considered complicit in the Avalon affair, were gathered on Katet. The Lashy, whose royal dynasty had stretched unbroken through their entire recorded history, learned a human term that day: balkanization. Their mighty kingdom was divided into dozens of minor states, with minor disputes and internecine squabbles that would cripple any effort to create a unified front. And as such, the Ravagers would no longer be a threat to any species. Perhaps one day, a strong enough personality would unite the kingdoms again, but that would be many cycles hence, and they would think twice before attacking humanity again. On the floor of the Alliance, the Terran senator submitted a long-prepared proposal. The war had lasted long enough, he said, and they had made their point. The Corral would end. Aid could be rendered. The 12 new Lashy subdelegates did not object. In the hours that followed, I had the opportunity to approach the Terran ambassador during a recess. If his species had merely won a conflict, he might have been mobbed by admirers and sycophants. But their overwhelming attack had brought more fear than respect, and so he sat alone. I gathered my courage and approached him. He, in turn, welcomed the companionship. "You are braver than most," he said. "We were weak before, and I had many friends. But now we are strong, and I anticipate a lonely future. Can you blame us?" I said, "We could never have imagined what you were capable of." "We have not been warriors for a very long time," he said, "but we never forgot how. A name is a promise, after all." "The fleeing," he chuckled. "Not quite," he said. "It was a mistranslation from a malfunctioning device. When we realized the error, it seemed too minor to correct." "A mistranslation?" He smiled, and for the first time I noticed the sharp teeth at the corner of his mouth. "Not the fleeing," he said. "It was the hunters.